So when Bob and Linda asked me to come and teach, they said, we want you to do a real in-depth teaching from the Torah portion. And because it's Tuesday, it's really kind of in the middle of the week. So I could choose this past week's or next week's. I choose this past week's because there's so much in Va'etchanan, which is begins Deuteronomy something, Deuteronomy 3, verse 23. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I actually want to talk about the first verses in the Torah portion, and we're going to dig, and we're going to do a lot of textual analysis, and I hope you'll enjoy and work with this with me. Okay? So now my Bible's in Hebrew, so if I'm going to read the text, if anybody wants to read the text in English, that's great. Otherwise, I'll just kind of loosely translate it. Unless you want to give me an English translation that I would read from. But whatever, it doesn't matter. Anyway, the portion begins where God, don't forget, we're in the middle, we're in Deuteronomy. We are in the middle of Moses' first speech. The whole book of Deuteronomy is Moses' speeches to the nation given in the last few weeks before he dies. And these speeches are all speeches that are summarizing things that Moses believes the nation needs to hear and understand before they enter the land of Israel. So it includes a recap of history, and it includes key commandments that he wants to make sure they understand. Warnings, make sure not to go, follow idol pagan worship, all kinds of stuff like that. Some of these talks recap events that have already happened, and in this first speech, it's very often referred to as the historical speech, because most of this first speech is recapping events, some which took place, a few decades earlier, some took place just a few weeks earlier. Okay, so here we're in the middle of the speech, and it begins as Father says, "And I plead to the Lord at that time, saying." And it begins a prayer that Moses is giving. He's telling the nation, this is what I did. At that time, and in a minute we'll talk about what that time was. At that time, I prayed to God, and he then has this plea from God to let him go into the land of Israel. As you remember, Moses sinned. What did he sin? He sinned at, they came to that area where there was no water, and God and the nation is clamoring for water, and God says to Moses, "Take your staff and speak to the rock, and water shall come forward." And instead, he went and he hit the rock. It's not clear if that was the problem or no. I don't want to discuss that. That's a whole nother Bible lesson. Exactly what was the problem there, but as a result, God says to Moses, "Because you did not sanctify me, because you didn't believe enough to sanctify my name," he then punishes Moses and Aaron, telling them they are not going to come into the land of Israel. Now that particular sin actually had taken place not that long before this. It's also in that last year before they go into the land of Israel. I don't know if you realize that in the middle of the book of Numbers, somewhere around chapter, I'll tell you exactly where, somewhere around chapter 18, 19, something like that. It's probably in the middle of chapter 19. We suddenly have 38 years go by. Until that point, the Bible is, not the Bible, but from Exodus, okay, from the Exodus, in the middle of Exodus, until Numbers around chapter 19, we are talking about the first 2 years in the desert, okay? From chapter 19, we fast forward, and we're the last year before they go into the land of Israel. So there's like 38 years there that we don't know anything about. Actually, and I'll just throw this at you. What is Numbers 19? How does it begin? Numbers 19 begins with the laws having to do with the red heifer. Okay, and what is the red heifer for? It's to purify, there's different kinds of impurities, biblical impurities, that you have to then purify yourself before you can come to the temple, before you come before God. And the most serious of these impurities is death. Somebody who has come in contact with a dead person, the purification of that to enable them to then go to the temple, bring a sacrifice or whatever, that is purified through the use of the ashes of the red heifer, okay? I once heard a brilliant statement. I think it's brilliant. You have a missing 38 years right there, right? You have and then all of a sudden, we don't know, we're in the last year. What happened in those 38 years? The laws of the red heifer. They were dealing with death. For 38 years, people were dying. A whole generation died off in 38 years. And the Bible doesn't tell us anything about those years except the laws of the red heifer. I think that's like brilliant. You say, what happened? Those death. Okay. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about tonight, but I had to share that with you because I think it's so powerful. Anyway, so what happens? We're talking today about this. So we're in the final year. We're in the final weeks after. Deuteronomy is very specific. We're in the last weeks before Moses dies. And Moses is telling them that he was pleading with God to let him come into the land. He says, please, verse 25, please let me pass into the land. Let me see the good land and the other side of the Jordan, the good mountain, this good mountain and the Lebanon. And then what does he say? He says, and the Lord was angry. Now, what does it say in the English? The Lord was angry
with me on account of you.
On account of you. Okay. Bad translation.
Okay.
Bad translation. Okay. Now, I'm going to ask you something else. Go back to Deuteronomy 1, verse 37.
What was the reference?
Deuteronomy 1, 37. Now, read me the first few words.
You want me to read?
Yeah.
Also, because of you, Adonai was angry with me and said, you too will not go in there.
Also what? Because of you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So on account of you and because of you are really the same thing. Okay? That's an accurate translation for Deuteronomy 1:37. There, Moses is recounting the sin of the spies. And he says, as a result of the sin of the spies, you're punished and you can't go into the land. Of course, he's referring to their parents, the previous generation. Okay? And then he says, and also God was angry with me and he wouldn't let me go in because of you. Now, Moses isn't punished because of the spies. But he is punished, and what basically he's saying, because of the mess up I had with you and you're clamoring for water and you got me so crazy and I hit the rock and whatever, okay? He says, it's all your fault that I'm also punished. That makes sense in Deuteronomy 1:37. In Deuteronomy 3:26, the word in Hebrew is lema'anchem, which doesn't mean because of you, it means for your sake. God was angry at me for your sake. Now, we're going to come back to that because the understanding what that means is going to be critical to what we're going to be studying tonight in this whole situation. Okay? Anyway, the end of the story is Moses is saying, God didn't listen to me. And he said, stop talking to me about this. I've had enough of this. And then what does he say? He says, go up to the to the top of the mountain and look out from all directions. And he's basically saying, you're going to go up to this mountain and you're not going to be able to enter the land, but you're going to be able to view the land from the mountain. And we know that this takes place at the end of Deuteronomy, when actually Moses goes up, when he dies and he is able to see. The very end of this chapter, he then says, and command Joshua, strengthen him and give him courage, for he will pass before this nation. He will conquer the land or divide the land, this land which you are now seeing, okay, which you will see. The last verse of this chapter is, we sat in the valley opposite the house of Peor. Okay? Now, do you remember what Peor is? The Baal Peor, do you remember what that was? That was a terrible, terrible situation where the nation sinned grievously, and it actually happens just a few weeks earlier, okay? They are in this valley, and then the Midianites and the Moabites send these women, prostitutes, to seduce the men, and they sin, and then there's this terrible plague. 24,000 Israelites are killed by God, until finally Phinehas gets up and he stabs this couple who were particularly brazen, okay, and then the plague stops, okay. So this is the background, and here it doesn't tell the story. It just says, and by the way, we were sitting in that valley, almost kind of reminding the nation, this is the background here, okay, we're in the background. One of the basic questions that comes up when we study these few verses is, when did this happen? This is the only time that we have mentioned that Moses came back to God and pleaded with him to allow him to go into the land. When these stories are told in Numbers, which is when the things happen and we have the account of it, there's no mention anywhere of this prayer. So when did it really happen? How can we fit this in, and how can we figure that out? Okay, so that's a question that we're going to be dealing with, and I'm going to be going back and comparing what we have here with the text in Numbers and fit it in and see what we learn from fitting it in that way. But before we get to that, I want to share with you a midrash. Do you know what a midrash is? For those of you who may not know, midrashic literature is essentially stories. Okay, not always, but a lot of it is stories. And these are stories that were initially told or recorded going back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. Most of them were then either recorded in the Talmud, which was, let's say, completed by the 5th century, or even later in different compilations of midrashic stories and commentary that can be as late as the 10th century, okay? It's a whole body of literature spread over different books with very similar styles. And they're different stories, they have served different functions. But the kind of midrash the kind of stories that I'm going to share with you today are essentially stories that kind of fill in the blanks at some of the stories that we're reading in the Bible. They use the biblical story as a jumping off point to then tell an additional story. The story itself is not it's not written in the Bible, so we can't say it actually happened. It may have happened, it may not have happened. Some of these stories are traditions that really go back thousands of years, way before they were ever recorded. These are stories that were passed down from generation to generation. But the function of these stories is either to, through a story, provide a commentary on a biblical passage, or to convey a message, a teaching of some sort, and sometimes both, okay? So I found a very interesting, in the same midrash, it's called the Midrash Tanchuma, I found two different stories that kind of flesh out this little passage here about Moses' prayer, which I think is very interesting in and of itself, because it gives us an understanding also about the limits of prayer or something like that I want to share with you. And it also will give you a sense of what is this midrashic literature, what's the style, what's going on. Okay, so the first one, he starts as follows. We know what the text of the prayer is here, so this is kind of fleshing it out more. And he says, okay, God, this is Moses talking to God. He says, Almighty God, everybody is the same to you. You treat the innocent and the evil in exactly the same way. He's accusing God of something incredibly serious. He's saying, the spies sinned because they slandered the land. But I, who was a loyal servant for 40 years, shepherding your nation through the desert, you treat both of us the same way. Neither of us can enter the land. He's accusing God of being unfair and unjust, okay? And then the Midrash goes on to say, he gives a story as a kind of like a story that, kind of fairy tale kind of story, but that illustrates the point. He says, what is this like? He says, it's like a king. A king has, king wants to marry a woman, and he sends messengers out to find him. He heard that there's a woman somewhere who's worthy to be queen, and he sends his messengers out to go check out this woman, make the arrangements. And the messengers come back, and so the king says, so what'd you find? How was this woman? And the messenger said, oh, you have never seen an uglier woman. Terrible. Okay? And meanwhile, there's this advisor to the king who didn't go out with the messengers. And the advisor says, no, she's a beautiful woman. There's no problem. You can marry her. The king says, okay, I'll listen to my advisor. And they send back the messengers to go bring the wife. And when he gets there, meanwhile, the father of the girl hears about what these messengers had said to the king about his daughter. And he says, no way I'm letting you into my palace. I heard what you said about the daughter. So then the advisor to the king comes, and he says, well, what about me? You can't let me in? I said good things about you. No, I'm not letting any of you in. And so it was with God and Moses. The ending of this is basically God, again, Moses says to God, this isn't fair. You're treating the good guys and me the good guy, and those bad guys in the very same way. Why did I sin? I defended your land when these spies came back, and I'm not getting any credit for that? Why are you treating me the same way? This story is a very, very powerful story because it also says something to us about prayer. This story is not shrinking from the idea of man being able to ask God, where's the justice in all of this? There is complete legitimacy in this. The message here is, I think, a very powerful one. Gives complete legitimacy for man to rail at God and say, where's the justice? Then it goes on to a second story that has a little bit of a different kind of thing. And here, the next midrash takes the word Va'etchanan, which means, and I pleaded. And he says, well, what does this word really mean? And typically in a midrash, when it starts asking what a word means, it doesn't necessarily delve into the literal meaning of the word, but it kind of finds associations connected with that word. In this case, the midrash lists many different words that have been used in the Bible to talk about prayer. And then it says, well, why does it use this word? Now, in basic Hebrew, we know this word Va'etchanan means plead. So you can cry, you can plead, you can pray. There's all these kind of words that can be used to pray. But the Midrash doesn't say because it means plead. It takes a similar word, a word that means free. Okay? Free. No cost. No cost. Okay? No payment. And he basically says, the Midrash then says, why does Moses use this word? Because he's coming before God with utter humility and saying, please, I know I don't deserve it. I'm asking you for a freebie. Let me go into the land just because you're giving it to me, not because I deserve it. So you see, the same Midrash has two opposite messages in a way. One message is saying, Moses rails at God. He believes he deserved to go in and that God was treating him unfairly. And the second Midrash says Moses comes with total humility saying, I recognize that I am not worthy, but let me go in anyway. Okay? And we're going to come back. I think also this is another way that you can look at prayer. This is the kind of prayer that we usually taught. Come before God in humility. Come before God realizing God is all-encompassing, all-powering, and we who come as ordinary human beings, how can we possibly say to God, gimme, 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 because, I deserve it. two different kinds of prayer. But I think it's brilliant and it's very important, very profound that we as human beings understand that we should be coming before God in humility, but yet there's a space for you to come before God when you have a complaint, when you see what you think is injustice, okay? And we're going to get back to what that means after this. But now I want to go back to the original question I posed, and that is, where does this section of Deuteronomy fit in with the stories that we heard as the original story was recounted in the book of Numbers? So let's go back to the book of Numbers, and here, if you want, you can follow along, but let me just summarize. I think it'll be simpler if I just summarize what we're doing. First of all, let's see the context. In Deuteronomy, the verse we just read, it begins by saying, and I prayed to God, or I pleaded with God at that time, okay? So, of course, the first question that we have is, what's that time? What time are we talking about? So if we look at the order of events in Moses' speech in Deuteronomy, we have the following. He talks about the spies, and he talks about the punishment of the spies. Then he goes into the progress that the children of Israel made just recently as they going through what is now Jordan. Okay, they have to bypass Edom, Moab, and Ammon. There's a war with the Amorites. There's a war with the Bashan, okay, which they win. Then he talks about the fact that Joshua is appointed as a successor. Then we have his recounting of his prayer to God. And finally, God is saying to him, go up on the mountain, and instead of going into the land, you're going to be able to see the land. That's the order of events as they are told in Deuteronomy. Now let's go back to the parallel events as they are recounted to us in the book of Numbers. And this is in book of Numbers for chapter 20, okay? So we begin with the sin of the rock and the water from the rock, okay? So what do we have there? We are again in a new generation, and the newer generation, the generation actually going to go into the land, and Moses sins, he loses his temper, he's upset, whatever it is that exactly happens, it is not pleasing to God. And clearly he loses his temper with the nation who's clamoring for water, okay? Then we have the issue of the bypassing Edom, the war with Amorites and the Bashan, just like we have here. Then we have the story of Balaam. Now keep in mind, the story of Balaam is probably not known to the children of Israel. There is no interaction between Balaam and the children of Israel. That's over there. We're told about it, but it's not something that the children of Israel are aware of. At least we have no knowledge that they're aware of it. So let's put that in parentheses. Then we have the story of the sin at Peor, that I was just telling you about, where they sent the prostitutes to lure the thing, and the terrible, what happened there. We have this terrible situation, and Moses is paralyzed. God sends a plague. Moses is paralyzed. He doesn't want to do, and it's Phinehas who comes up, and with his immediate action, the plague is stopped. Okay, keep that in mind. Then we go on, we have the story of the daughters of Slavchad, that's less important. And then we have God, like out of the blue really, not in response to something Moses said. God is saying, okay, Moses, go up on the mountain, look, and you're going to see exactly parallel to what we have here. Go up on the mountain, you're not going into the land, but look at the land from the mountain from afar. And right after that, Moses turns to God and says, please select my successor. Okay? What are the main differences here between the two accounts? In the account in Deuteronomy, Joshua's appointment as successor is told to us before Moses has his prayer. Okay? Whereas in Numbers, the appointment of Joshua is at the end of the story, after he's told to go up onto the mountain. Okay, it's a slight difference. Okay? Now, but if I combine the stories, all right, the only way to understand, if I take it as a given, God's command to Moses, you will go up on the mountain. Instead of going into the land, you're going to go up and view the land from afar. Okay? The prayer has to be right before that. That's the only place it fits in. in the original account in Numbers, okay? That's where it fits, okay? So now let's see what happens and I'd like to actually look at that verse in Numbers for a moment, because I think we see something fairly revealing there as well, okay? So in Numbers 27, verse 12, we have God saying to Moses, and here I'm going to ask you, Linda, if you can read just a few words. Numbers 27, verse 12. Read the first half of the scripture.
Adonai said to Moses, "Climb this mountain in the Arabim range."
Okay, fine. God said to Moses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And he says the same thing. He says, because you sinned against me with the water and all that kind of thing, you're not going to go into the land, just go up and you'll see the land from the mountain. Then verse 15.
Moses said to Adonai.
Okay. You're missing here the fact that in the Hebrew, the word said uses two completely different verbs. Okay? In verse 12, it is the typical word for said, particularly when it's a word that used for said whether God speaks to Moses or Moses speaks to God. It's a very neutral, rather soft word. He said, I said to you, you said to me. It's not a word of command. It's not a word of harshness in any way, okay? In the Hebrew, though, it's very interesting. In verse 15, it says, Vayidaber. Moses spoke to God. That word is never used for Moses speaking to God. It has only ever been used for God speaking to Moses. And it's only used when, typically it's used where God speaks to Moses and says, this is a command, or command the children of Israel. In other words, if I were to accurately translate the word, I would say it instructs Moses, or speaks to Moses with the intention of instruction. It's a harsher word. Okay, speak rather than said. Speak in English also is a harsher word than said. But I would say in most contexts, it has the context of instruct. It's within the context of instruct. If you look at that, then, in this verse in Numbers, you have a very strange situation. Moses is instructing God. It's a little bit odd. There's a harshness there that is not usually present, okay? So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to put all these together and I'm going to take what we have here, okay? If I combine the prayer and the interchange between God and Moses that we have in Deuteronomy with the story as it is here related, I have the following. I have Moses beseeching God to let him go to the land, and God is angry. We have that in Deuteronomy, right? And I said I would go back to that. God was angry with me for your sake. I'm still going to get back to the for your sake, okay? God was angry with me for your sake, and then he says, go up onto the mountain. In return, after they go up to the mountain, go back to Numbers 27, Moses spoke to God harshly. It makes sense. God is angry at Moses, and Moses is angry at God. And Moses says, okay, you're not going to let me go? Then you need to appoint a leader who's going to do the right thing, okay? This is a harsh interchange. It's not a soft interchange. Whereas in Deuteronomy, even though we have that expression of anger, first of all, in Deuteronomy, Joshua has already been appointed. At least we're told Joshua is the one who, at that time, around that time, he says, and this is in verse 21. And at that time, I commanded Joshua, saying, you've seen everything that God has done. You're going to go up. You're going to lead him. And then afterwards, in the context of going up to the mountain, God says, and command Joshua, strengthen him and give him courage. We don't have it as the original appointment. We have it just encourage Joshua in what will be his role. So the first question that I have, I think we have two things here. First of all, we suddenly have an angry exchange that goes two directions between God and Moses. Not just that God is angry at Moses, but Moses is kind of angry at God, or at least he's responding with a certain kind of anger or harshness in his voice. But the second thing is that we have Joshua in the Numbers account being, if we take this together, Joshua is being appointed as part of an angry exchange. Whereas in Deuteronomy, Joshua is appointed as a natural kind of thing. Okay? So now, what conclusions am I drawing from this? Okay? So first of all, the question we might add is, if the prayer was in Numbers, why is it not there? Why is this exchange not in Numbers? Why are we missing the prayer and the anger on part of God? Why are we only getting half the conversation? Okay? And then when we get it in Deuteronomy, we get only the anger from God. We don't have the anger from Moses. It's only when we put it together do we see this anger. So first of all, keep in mind that Numbers is the account of what happened that is more or less an account for posterity. We're the audience of Numbers. Numbers is not recited to the people of Israel. The people of Israel experienced Numbers, each with their own interpretation. They saw what they saw, they didn't saw what they didn't saw. The Numbers, the account in Numbers is given to us so that we, generations later, will have that account. Okay? But Deuteronomy is Moses speaking to the nation right here and then. It is critical in Deuteronomy that the appointment of Joshua not be seen as coming out of an angry exchange. The appointment of Joshua has to be calm, natural, because Joshua's going to be the leader. And you can't have any kind of situation where somebody will say, oh, he's not really a leader, it was an afterthought, it came out of an angry exchange, it was not really what should have happened, okay? Now, the truth of the matter is, if you go through in the book of Numbers, okay, basically what you see the picture, if you take the various events that happened in the book of Numbers as you're moving through, and I'll just review again where they were. We have Moses with the rock, okay, where he really failed there. Shall we say, his leadership failed there for the first time, okay, and then we have the sin at Peor, where Moses is paralyzed, and God is throwing this plague at the nation, and they're just dying like flies, and it's only Phinehas, who's the next generation, who acts, and then the plague stops. And then we see the daughters of Tzlafchad, I don't know how you say that in English, the daughters who came, they said their father died, and they don't have a territory, and Moses, they don't have inheritance, and Moses has no idea how to handle that. Until God says, listen to them, they're right. Moses, and this is an issue of inheritance. We're not talking about major issues of life and death. We are not talking about miracles. We are just talking about the kind of judgment a leader should make. Moses is speechless. And right after that, God sends him up, says, you're not going to go into the land, etc. What we're seeing, the picture that's painted for us in Numbers, is a picture of Moses, who's no longer a leader. Moses, who maybe doesn't know how to relate to this new generation.